Okay, it is now 2 o'clock. Thank you all for joining us and Happy New Year. My name is Deandra Durand. I'm a program assistant with the Russell Sage Foundation. And today we're going to be having our webinar on the Dissertation Research Grants. I'll let my colleague introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maya Donald. I'm a program assistant with Russell Sage.
Thank you very much. We're going to get started. And again, thank you for spending your afternoon with us. So before we get started with the webinar, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping notes. So first off, this meeting is being recorded. If for whatever reason you need to leave early, or maybe you just want to take notes or go back to the recording, we will have this recording up within a couple of days after the meeting. So I would check back Thursday or Friday on our website. Um, uh, for any questions, please use the Q&A function. And please note that we will answer the questions at the end of the webinar. But if you do have any questions that pop up during our presentation, please feel free to add them into the chat, and we'll do our best to answer all those questions at the end of the webinar. Please refrain from asking any topic-specific questions. We do try and keep these webinars more general. So if you do have any specific questions related to your project, I would recommend that you email us directly with the email listed below at programs@rsage.org. And if we, for whatever reason, run out of time, or maybe we just miss your question, please feel free to email us at programs@rsage.org. Now, just a quick rundown of our agenda for this afternoon. First, we're going to go over who we are as an organization and a foundation. And then we're going to go over some overall funding priorities. So what are RSF's current programs and special initiatives? Then we're going to go into the dissertation research grants application process, which I'm sure all of you are very eager to learn more about. And then we're going to go into some generalized application tips and frequently asked questions. After that section, we will go over the Q&As any questions that you may have added to our Q&A section.
So the Russell Sage Foundation is a private foundation. We're based in New York City. We were founded in 1907 by Margaret Olivia Sage, the widow of Russell Sage, for the improvement of social and living conditions in the United States. Between 1907 and 1944, we were a source of institutional and direct support, providing information for private social agencies, working on things like poverty reduction, social work, housing, public health, industrial relations, those kinds of things. Since 1945, we've worked in funding for basic social science research, that is strengthening the methods, data, and theoretical core of the social sciences in order to address some of our interests in understanding the nation's social, political, and economic problems.
So, the Russell Sage Foundation has 4 main program areas. These are our long-standing program areas, including the behavioral science and decision-making in context, future of work, social, political, and economic inequality, and race, ethnicity, and immigration. You should note that each of these program areas have RFPs on our website, which are going to be shared in the chat. And the questions that you'll find on the RFP are not exhaustive and should be treated more as examples and guidelines. Russell Sage is more interested in innovative social science research methods. So if your program or if your project falls slightly outside of those questions that you may find in the RFP, that's okay. Um, we may take a look at it, or we may find it interesting enough or innovative enough for consideration of funding. You should also note that we recognize that these program areas do overlap or may overlap. Um, and if you have any confusion of where your project may fall, feel free to email us, and we will be more than happy to provide guidance for you. Um, Very quickly, so each of these program areas that I mentioned before, behavioral science and decision making in context, this one evolved from previous longstanding programs called the behavioral economics to encourage economists and non-economists to study economic, social, political, and psychological decision-making processes, attitudes, behaviors, and institutional practices. The future of work has been around since 1994. So we were one of the I think actually we were one of the first organizations to do this type of research in future of work, where we are interested in anything that impacts the labor market, including but not limited to the impacts of AI, the effects of the minimum wage on wages, unionization and worker power, etc. The social, political, economic inequality program examines factors that contribute to social and economic inequalities in the United States. And the REI program, or I'm sorry, the Race, Ethnicity, and Immigration program, which used to be two separate programs, cultural contact and immigration, is interested in how we integrate new populations into the US and how we interact with each other. Now, what RSF does not fund, however, is studies focused on health outcomes and studies on educational processes, teachers' outcome, or curricular development. We will consider educational studies for student outcomes as it pertains to entering the labor market, but very narrow scope. But again, if you do have any questions relating to does my project fit into the program area, please feel free to send us an email. In addition to our main program areas that were discussed before, we do have some other initiatives that RSF seeks out our grants for. And again, these program areas do have RFPs on our website as well. So the first one is the Immigration and Immigrant Integration, which is co-funded with the Carnegie Corp of New York. And this particular program is dedicated towards really studying the integration of immigrant populations in the United States. The next one, which has a very, very long title, Promoting Educational Attainment and Economic Mobility Among Racially, Ethnically, and Economically Diverse Groups after the 2023 Supreme Court decision to ban race-conscious college admission policies. Whew. This one is co-funded with the Hewlett Foundation, Spencer Foundation, and the William T. Grant Foundation. And this program area, or the special initiative, is really interested in or understanding how organizations and people are reacting to the Supreme Court decision to end affirmative action. And our most recent new initiative, which is geared towards early career scholars, is the Causal Research on Criminal Justice System, which is co-funded with the Arnold Ventures Foundation. We are going to be having a webinar on this in March, but I would again check our RFP for more information on our new initiative.
So our dissertation research grants is a program that provides 1-year grants up to $15,000 to eligible doctoral students working on research that's related to any of our program areas that we just discussed on the previous 2 slides. We'll talk a little bit more in later slides about what eligibility looks like and what we're hoping to see from our applications. The deadline is going to be February 4th. It's going to be at 2 p.m. Eastern time. So make a note of that in your calendar. What can you request funding for? You can have a stipend of up to $7,500. You can pay for research assistants to help you with your work. You can pay request funds for participant incentives, for purchasing data, for access fees, things like that. You can request funding for transcription of interviews or lab costs, and you can request funding to travel to collect data. One important note is that we don't request formal budgets at the time of application. A couple sentences in your application is sufficient to let us know what sorts of things you would be requesting funding for. And when you apply at this February's deadline, you can receive funding starting this summer.
Okay, so now we're going to go over some eligibility requirements for the dissertation research grants. So first, to be eligible for dissertation research, you must be enrolled at a US-based institution. So unfortunately, anyone that is not enrolled in a US-based institution is ineligible. Um, you may not have received a previous DRG grant. So anyone who receives a DRG grant, you are limited to receiving this one time only. So if you have received it in the past, you are ineligible. You must be ABD with all other program requirements completed by the time that the funds are dispersed, and which we will go over later on, but please keep that in mind that you must be ABD by the time that the funds are dispersed. As well, you must provide or dissertation must be approved or pending approval by the committee, again, by the time of funding. DRG prioritizes traditionally underrepresented applicants in the social sciences, and applicants that are not fully funded by home institution or are funded only through a TA or RA position.
So this slide goes over a little bit of what happens once you submit your application and details our internal and external review processes. So once you submit your application on February 4th at 2 p.m., it'll be reviewed internally by our program staff. Based on the results of that review, which are mostly for programmatic fit, for if your application is at the correct stage, if it's a well-written application, those kinds of things, we'll send it for external review by topical or methodological experts in the field. We'll talk a little bit more about what we ask our internal and external reviewers later in the presentation. If you receive positive reviews, you'll be asked to respond to reviewer comments and then receive a funding decision in May of 2025. Once you receive that decision, that will come with a request to submit additional materials, such as your budget and other materials for due diligence. We'll discuss what those requirements are shortly. If you submit those materials by May 23rd, your grant can start as early as July 1st. If you submit those materials by June 16th, your grant may start as early as August 1st. The goal of our presentation in terms of talking about this review timeline is really to get you past the internal staff review. We do end up screening out a lot of applications just because they're not a good fit for the foundation and our funding priorities, or because they spend too much time, you have limited space and expend too much of that on things that we're not as interested in. And we want to see more details on the research design. Yeah.
Okay, so the application materials, the DRG applications, again, are due February 4th at 2 p.m. So please, again, make a note of that in your calendars. We will close the portal at 2 p.m. So it's very important that you submit your application. If you do have any problems with the site, please email us. But again, the deadline is February 4th, 2 p.m. So DRG application forms are via Flux. Um, uh, you must register for Flux prior to submitting an application. So we typically recommend that you apply at the very least 2 weeks before the application. So that way, because there's usually a pretty big backlog and it could take us some time to register all those applications. So please make sure to register ahead of way in advance. Your proposal is single space 5 pages. That does not include any references, charts, tables, etc. Um, but please make sure to utilize as much of the page limit as possible and be mindful not to go over the page limit. You're also required to submit an abbreviated CV of no more than 5 pages. Going back to the proposal, your proposal should outline your research and methodology that you will be using to facilitate your research. So please make sure that when you are writing your proposal that you're giving us as much detail as possible about your methodology and the research methods that you're going to be using. I would not suggest adding parts that explain your qualifications because your CV is going to speak to that as it is. You have very limited space, so please use that space to provide as much detail about your research and your methodology to advance that research.
If you are approved for funding in May 2025, we'll then ask you to submit a letter from your dissertation advisor that certifies that the work that you have proposed for funding is the same work as will be completed for your dissertation. We'll ask for a budget using the RSF budget template. We'll share this with you when the time comes. Along with that, we request a budget narrative. That's just a brief explanation of what you're requesting funding for and a project timeline. IRB approval or exemption, a data access confirmation if applicable, pre-registration confirmation if applicable to your project. And the one caveat to this is that if you're defending your dissertation in the spring, you can submit, we just require the letter to be submitted prior to funds being dispersed. Because the letter has to certify that your dissertation has been approved by your committee.
Okay, so now we're going to go over some generalized tips and tricks for our review process. So first, your project is going to have an internal review process. So this is basically where programs or staff with Russell Sage review the applications and determine their fit for the foundation. At this stage, you will either be moved on to external review or you will receive a desk reject. And sometimes these desk rejects could be for the following reasons. It's just simply not an RSF funding priority. So for example, like I mentioned earlier, how we do not fund projects that are health outcome related, right? So unfortunately, it may be a fantastic project. We don't do that because there are much larger foundations that already do that, and we really want to focus on research projects that do not get as much attention. The project may not be US related or of the social sciences, or it has something to do with operational support, program evaluations, etc. There's lack of sufficient detail. So maybe there isn't an emphasis on the research questions, or maybe the design and methodology is not quite explained or developed. And or perhaps the literature review was not as sufficiently reviewed as we would have liked. So again, going back to our proposal, make sure that you really focus on explaining the strengths of your project and even to some point where those pitfalls may be. Excuse me. Some other reasons is that it may just be vague and there may be some design flaws in the research. Um, it's there's already this project is already being supported by sufficient funders, or it's a little too descriptive, or maybe it's a little too preliminary, and needs more work at it. But if you do have any questions about specifically why your project was not reviewed for external review, you can always email us for further feedback, and we'd be more than happy to provide that for you.
If you pass internal review, we'll send your application out for external review by 3 or 4 reviewers. And we ask them to provide us with a funding recommendation and feedback for the project. So if you are going to external review, no matter what, you're going to get some helpful comments to improve your project. We ask reviewers to comment on if the research questions are important or compelling. Do the questions match the research design and the methodology that you're proposing to conduct? Is there sufficient power, for example? Are your questions well grounded in the prior theory and literature? Do you have the qualifications to carry out the project? At the dissertation level, this is a little bit less important. If you're if you're a grad student in economics, we want you to be doing a project in econ, things like that. Similar for the contribution of the project. At the dissertation level, we're not necessarily looking for you to be doing something incredibly groundbreaking, but we do want to fund work that's not just retreading paths and work that's already been done. And then we have a general area where we ask them to provide comments that would help strengthen or improve the project. If you receive sufficient support in your external review, you're asked to respond to these reviews. Reviewer comments will be sent back around March 21st, and they'll be due back April 7th.
Okay, so some tips and suggestions for your applications as we move forward. Please make sure that project is a fit for RSF. So again, we are a institution that studies U.S. Social science related topics. So please make sure that it is. And if you are confused about whether or not your project is a fit, you can always email us and we will do our best to answer your email within 48 hours. Make sure that the research questions should drive the proposal. So we want to see what the methodology is and what your ultimate research will answer. Balance the proposal narrative, provide sufficient information in your proposal. Don't overpromise or exaggerate what your project may provide. Sometimes it's good to note that there may be some limitations to your project. Show an understanding of the strengths and limitations, as I had just mentioned. And if asked to respond to reviewers, take time to graciously respond to those questions with in-depth responses. The reviewers will notice if you do not fully answer their question or ignore their questions. So please make sure to graciously thanks the reviewers, but also to answer their questions to the best of your ability. Check our website and FAQs for any questions that could be easily answered. And make sure to submit on time. And register for the RSF portal well in advance of the deadline, as sometimes as we get closer to the deadline, it may be harder and harder for us to keep up with all the registrations that are coming in. And always keep in mind that, RSF receives many more and very good proposals than we can fund. So if you are not selected for funding at this time, don't take that as a bad thing, but as a learning experience. and we will always try and do our best to provide feedback um, if asked. And for anyone that is sent to external review, whether you are funded or not, you will get reviewer comments back.
Lastly, just a couple of other resources that we have that may be useful. First is the RSF Journal of Social Sciences, which you can find at the link in the slide. This is an open access journal. We accept papers from PhD candidates. So may be useful just as you're developing your proposal, or if you're interested in reading a little bit more broadly about the kinds of things that we at RSF are interested in. Second, we have a dataset repository, which links to datasets that have been produced through RSF funding, which you can find at russellsage.org/datasets. Deadlines for all other program areas are available on our website. And just to clarify once again that there are no restrictions based on citizenship for your applications.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Our website is www.russellsage.org, and our email, where you could email myself, Maya, and my supervisor who's not on the call today, Stephen Glauser, programs@rsage.org. We are going to start answering questions that have come to us in the Q&A section. There are quite a few questions, so we will do our best to answer all or most of them. However, we do not get to your questions today. Please feel free to email us at programs@rsage.org, and we will do our best to answer those questions to you as soon as possible. Okay, so I guess we can start at the top. So we're just going to go in chronological order of how these things have come in. So the first question I see is, hi, can you please elaborate on what ABD means according to your criteria? So that just basically means that the only thing you have left to do is the dissertation. Everything else should be completed. Do you have to have that dissertation, or does everything need to be completed by the time of your application being submitted? No. But by the time that the funds are dispersed. So if you recall from earlier in this presentation, you, depending on when you get your due diligence materials back, you could either start August 1st or July 1st. So again, please keep that in mind. But that's basically what ABD means, that we just want you to only focus on the dissertation. You shouldn't have any classes left to do or whatever is involved in your specific programs.
I
Oh,
can take the next one,
sure.
which is a question about a fellowship. There have been a number of questions about what institutional support means and eligibility. I just want to clarify on that slide. The only eligibility requirements are the ones listed. Deandra, if you want to go back to that slide really quickly.
Which slide was that again? Oh,
That's the eligibility and priority slide.
sorry about that. Let me just get back to that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
It's okay.
I think it's 8.
Technology. Here we go.
So the only eligibility requirements that we have are that you're enrolled at a US-based institution, your ABD, your dissertation's approved, you haven't previously received a grant. When we talk about priority and traditionally underrepresented applicants and funding that you have or don't have from your home institution, those are because the goal of our Dissertation Research Grants Program is to support students who would not otherwise be able to complete their dissertations with the support that currently exists. So we're trying to reach the most needy students and sort of support them and support their research. When we talk about underrepresented applicants, we're talking about diversity really quite broadly, in your typical terms of race, ethnicity, gender, but also geographically in terms of the types of institutions that you're at. Um, HBCUs, minority serving institutions, those sorts of things. So if you are not a traditionally underrepresented applicant, or you do have a fellowship, or you do have a good funding package from your home institution, and I know that's always relative. That doesn't mean you're not eligible. It may mean that depending on the overall pool of applications that we get, if you're on the margin, we may decide to prioritize another application in terms of the limitations that we have of the numbers that we can send out for external review or the numbers that we can fund in a given cycle. Because there are other applicants that fit better in the broader goals of the program. Yeah, on that question specifically.
Great. And I also want to clarify just one more thing about the eligibility requirements as well. So when it comes to enrollment at US-based institutions, again, the Russell Sage Foundation does not limit based on nationality. Um, for this particular program, we only limit based on US institutions. So you could be from a different outside of the United States or a citizen of another country outside of the United States. But as long as you are enrolled at a US-based institution, then you're fine. Um, I did see, I'm sorry, I'm just going back to our questions. What does traditionally underrepresented mean? Can you talk more about it? Um, so this by traditionally underrepresented, you know, we try and cast as big of a net as possible in this regard. So this could mean uh racial or gendered underrepresentation in social sciences, but it could also mean institutions as well. So if you are from an institution that does not receive a lot of funding or is not an Ivy League um, institution, we might look at you a little more closer than we would someone from an Ivy League school. Not saying that we do not fund Ivy League or R1 institutions. We do. But at the end of the day, first, what we're going to look at is the strength of the proposal, how, what is the, what is the value of the proposal that is being presented to the Russell Sage Foundation, and then we'll weigh in other factors. But we do try and target these areas because we want to have as much of a diversity of thought when it comes to improving social sciences. Um, let's see. The next question, can you elaborate whether RSF is interested in projects that would be in the analysis and writing phase, with data collection finished by the grant start date, or really in those that include some data collection during the grant period? Um, from my understanding, yes. Uh, we w- this funding priority, and I think we have something here that goes on how you could use what is going on. The funding. Okay, so going back to this slide, we can show you uh, what you can use those fundings for. So, or what you can use the DRG application for. Applicant stipend of up to $7,500, research assistance, data acquisition fee. So if you are collecting data, apologies, then yes, of course. If you are in the writing analysis phase, basically this grant is to help you get across the finishing line. So if that means that you're going to be using some of this money to pay for your rent, by all means, please pay your rent. Um, if it is for data collection, or for you to analyze your data, then yes, of course, this grant is meant to help students who are ABD finish the line and receive their PhD. Um, Oops. Okay. Just looking here, which ones we have quite a few still in our queue, so we're just trying to see which ones we can kind of consolidate.
We have a number of questions about the US-based topic of research. Yes, we do require the research to be US focused, so studying a population or a subject in the United States. Um, there are, of course, some questions about comparative studies across with the US and another location, or a dissertation about another country, but the findings are relevant to the US. It might be a good idea to send your project abstract or some information about it to our email, which is programs@rsage.org, so we can give you a more specific answer. There are cases where we fund research done in other countries that's relevant to the US. For example, policy that doesn't exist in the US but exists in another country that we might be interested in. But those are a little bit more marginal and on a case-by-case basis. So if you're doing a project in another country, or a project that's in the US and in another country that you're interested in receiving funding for, I'd recommend sending us an email with details about your project.
Also, just to add on to that point, if you are doing a comparative study, we will only fund the portions of the project that are related to the United States. So let's say that you're doing a comparative study on the United States and Mexico. We're only going to be funding those parts that are related to the United States, not to the parts that are related to Mexico. So yeah, that is one of our few caveats to our research priorities. Um, I see here a question. Are external reviewers from your discipline or across the social sciences? How interdisciplinary should the literature review portion be? So, to answer the first question, external reviewers are typically going to be across the spectrum of social sciences. We like to try, because Russell Sage Foundation is an interdisciplinary research foundation. So we have economists, sociologists, psychologists, historians, all of them. So when we do uh, recruit our external reviewers, we do our best to have them match to your project based on relevance, um, also based on what type of research methods you're doing. So if you're doing qualitative research, we want to have qualitative researchers giving you feedback. Um, and we do try and have as diverse a pool as possible, because we want to make sure that you're kind of hearing from all angles, right? And I would encourage you to have your literature review be as interdisciplinary as possible, because sometimes, you may be stuck in one particular area, but not realizing that, oh, these sociologists they found some stuff that I didn't realize, or that pertains to my research. So, and the more interdisciplinary that you are, the stronger your proposal will appear when reviewed. Um, it says here from Veronica, thank you, Veronica. On the grant web page, it says that RSF prioritizes applicants who do not have sufficient time to devote to dissertation. Does that include part-time PhD students that work full-time? Yes. Please apply. That pertains to you. Um, let's see.
We have two questions. First, I'm seeing a question that says the DRG application in Flux states that we can request up to 10,000. The grant is for 15,000. The grant, I can confirm that the grant is for 15,000. That's a typo, as we just raised the limit from 10,000 this year. So the grant is for 15,000, and we will update that typo.
Also, correct me if I'm wrong, Maya, but we are giving 15 grants. Is that correct?
I think the number's a little bit flexible,
Okay,
but I think that's around the target for this
right.
year.
So I did see a question earlier. I think it's toward the bottom. I can't find it right now. But to whoever asked that question, our target is around 15 applicants will receive $15,000 of from the for the dissertation research grants. Um, but that, like my colleague said, is flexible depending on the pool of applicants. On average, we have received um, well, it's hard to recall. It's been several cycles.
Uh,
Uh,
we've received about 300 in
yes.
the past. This is the fourth year that we're running the program, and each year we've received about 300
Yeah.
applications.
So it is a highly competitive process. Um, I believe I don't I'm sure we mentioned earlier, but even in our regular research grants, we fund out of all the people that apply about 5 to 6% of applicants. So again, if you're not funded for us, that does not mean that you have a poor research project. We have a very high bar to reach. But we do appreciate your time. Um,
I wanted to run through, there are some questions about how much time to devote to lit review versus methodology and research design, a question about what balancing the proposal narrative mean. When we say balance the proposal, we mean use as much of the space as you can to talk about the research design, the research questions. Give us, the meat of your project to evaluate, while also including enough of a lit review, enough of the theory across disciplines to tell us that your work is well grounded in the established research. So uh, that's one of those questions that's about that. Um,
I do I want to respond to this one question just to provide some clarity. Someone asked, are we responsible for providing diversity or background information regarding our institution? No. Um, we know. We could look up your institutions on our own. It's fine. Um, uh, really what we want you to focus on is the proposal itself. We want you to make sure that when you're writing your proposal, that you give us as much detail as possible. Like my colleague said before, use as much of the space as possible to describe your research methodology and what you are conducting your research on. We don't need you to give us detailed information about the diversity of your institution. We can look that up ourselves. We are familiar with many of the institutions, and if we're not, we can Google it. So, again, just list your whatever's in your CV will speak for itself. We can research or we can ascertain that for ourselves. What we cannot ascertain is your research methods and your project. That is what we need you to explain to us.
we've also had a couple of questions. I've typed answers to these, but I'll answer it verbally as well. We've had a couple of questions about retroactively paying for funds that have already been spent on studies. Unfortunately, we're not able to provide funding in that way. So we're only able to provide funding for expenses um, made after the grant is dispersed. I am also seeing a question about if you have multiple topics in your dissertation, if you have if we should focus on a specific chapter. Um, yeah, if you want to focus on a specific chapter, particularly if that chapter is a good fit for RSF's funding priorities, and the other chapters may not be such a good fit for our priorities. And particularly if you're requesting funds to support research to develop that particular chapter, that's a reasonable thing to do. Um, question about including preliminary results. Yes, please include those. Those are helpful. If you're running into an issue with page limitations, we do accept appendices. Please don't abuse that. We don't want to see a 5-page application and then a 5-page appendix, but you can add a page of graphs of results as an appendix in your application.
I see a question here from Sharnika. And I apologize if I mispronounce your name. If I am near graduation, but eligible to apply, will that impact my application? As long as you have not completed your dissertation. So if I'm not sure I understand completely what you mean by near graduation. I did see a question about this earlier from another attendee. Basically, you have to be ABD. That means all of the other program requirements for your program need to be completed, except the dissertation. If you have already completed your dissertation or you are going to be completed with that dissertation by the time the funds are dispersed, then no, unfortunately, you're not eligible. But if you are still working on that dissertation and then yes, if that answers your question. So short answer, as long as that dissertation still needs to be written up, yes, you're eligible.
I just typed an answer to a question, but I'm seeing another question about having a dissertation that's 2 or 3 papers. We do recommend that you you talk about one paper in a lot of detail, and then you can provide a more broad overview of your other paper or papers. That's just so we can get a really good sense of the research design, and can really get into the meat of that rather than having a broad overview of 3 papers. That's sort of a high level. There's not a ton to evaluate there.
I see a question from another attendee. I am a PhD student in economics focusing on health insurance market. Does RSF fund research in health economics or in my area of interest? So again, this is it depends. If again, if you have any topic specific questions, I would recommend that you email us so that we could better ascertain your fit for our program. But to quickly answer your question, uh, it depends basically on what your outcome is going to be. If you are talking about the inequalities of the healthcare system, then sure, um, we may consider that for funding. Um, but if it has to do with health outcomes of patients, then no, it's not going to be eligible. But whoever submitted that question, I would recommend that you email us at programs@rsage.org. Um, and I would recommend that you also email us a one-page abstract so that we could better ascertain your particular question. And I'll just go back to that final slide so that everyone can see there. John Green, thank you for your questions. We'll do the best to answer your questions. So, can you speak to the level of technical detail you want for detailing the methodology? Um, we just want as much information as possible. Everyone has kind of different methods. So if you are doing mixed methods, qualitative, quantitative, uh, we just want to know how you're going to go about uh, conducting your research. For literature review, should I review not just literature from different areas of academic economics, but from social? I believe that we had covered that question earlier as well. Um, the answer is yes, ideally, if you can, because it would just make your research or your proposal that much stronger. Again, to reiterate, Russell Sage is a interdisciplinary foundation. So the more knowledge you have from areas outside of your expertise, and we don't expect you to be experts, but the more outside of that, then the stronger your proposal will be. So ideally, yes, if you can. Um, but again, if you have any more questions, please feel free to email us at programs@rsage.org.
Looks like we're getting to the end of our questions. I think I can hit a couple. Um, if you only need $5,000, I would apply for the full 15,000. Take the $7,500 as a stipend. It comes no strings attached. Um,
Also,
we
you could use it for your rent. If
yeah,
you have rent to pay,
yeah,
I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty nice.
yeah. Truly, we're trying to make grants at the 15,000 level. If they're approved, that makes it a lot easier on our grants management staff. Um, no, you are not able to request more of a stipend, unfortunately. Yes, if you have a TA-ship, your application will still be considered. Um, you can, if you need 2 pages for your references, so references are not included in the page limit. If you need 2 pages for your charts and tables, that's acceptable. Make them large enough so that we can read them. But again, we don't want you to be using the space to expand on your application. Um, let's see. Um, if we don't do retro payment, it may be helpful, but again, I'm not sure that it is the best use of your space in your application to discuss what you've already spent or about the hardship caused by self-funded projects. I know, it's a real struggle out there. But that doesn't necessarily help us evaluate if your project is a good project or a good candidate for funding, as we really want to hear details about the proposed research.
I see a question here. Do you welcome proposals in the field of African studies that are at the intersection of humanities and social sciences? Yes. I mean, again, it depends on the research topic. Whoever answered or asked that question, I would recommend that you email us an abstract of your project so we could better evaluate whether it is a good fit for us. But do we limit or do we exclude Africana studies from our applicant pool? No, of course. We are an interdisciplinary organization and we accept applicants from across the spectrum of applications. But if you have specifically questions about whether or not your project is a fit for us, I would recommend that you email us a one-page abstract to the email on the screen.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. This webinar will be recorded and posted on our website shortly in the next couple of days. If you have any further questions that come up as you're thinking more, as you're putting together the application, you can email us at programs.rsage@rsage.org. Again, I'm Maya Donald.
And I am Deandra Durand. Thank you and Happy New Year.